Thanks to all who are joining. We're going to give it just another minute or two, and then we'll get underway. Well, let's begin. Thank you all for joining this Secretary Speaker series focused on extreme heat. My name is Wade Crowfoot, and I serve as our California Natural Resources Secretary. If you haven't joined for one of these discussions before, our speaker series is all about raising big ideas, key priorities of the Newsom administration, and featuring leaders across California and beyond who are helping us confront some of our largest environmental challenges. It's been a sizzling summer across California and the American West. I don't have to tell you that. And also across the globe. Did you know that last month, July 2024, was the hottest month on our planet since humans began recording temperatures across the globe? We've got a great group of leaders today to help us unpack this trend, and most importantly, how we're protecting Californians and Americans as these extreme heat get more extreme. During our conversation today, we'll use the chat function that all of us by this point know in Zoom. My colleague Geeta Chandra, who deserves credit for organizing our discussion here today, will be populating the chat with information on our speakers and their organizations, as well as important information resources that will come up in conversation. So be sure to keep your chat on. Also, you can ask a question or share an observation using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen at any point during our discussion. We as panelists will see those questions. Some will be able to respond to you directly via our keyboards. Others will bring into the conversation. We are recording this discussion here today, so if you come back to our website, resources.ca.gov, in about a day, you'll have a recording of this discussion. And we encourage you to share it with others that may be interested. Included with the recording of the discussion will be a copy of all the information links provided in our chat. So let's jump into the conversation. And as I said, we've got a great set of panelists. Their names and affiliations are in our chat function, and we'll introduce them in just a moment. But first, I wanted to give a high-level, sort of level-setting view of what we face with extreme heat in California. So I'd ask my colleague James to start the slides. Now, these photographs illustrate that heat is nothing new to California. We have variable temperatures, we have desert regions, hotter parts of the state. In fact, this weather has created this beach culture and part of our identity of being a great place to be outside and recreate. Next slide. But let's be clear, climate change is driving hotter temperatures, and that means our heat waves, those hottest periods of temperatures, weather that we experience, are going to become more common, more intense and severe, and longer lasting. Next slide. What we see is that this average annual temperature has ticked up since 1895. And actually, it's increased about 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that may not seem like a lot if you look at the overall average, but we know that the graph on the right demonstrates that since the 1980s, this warming trend has accelerated. Next slide. And if we take a look at an average July temperature since 1895, we see significant change. So this slide, it's important to key on the two numbers that are circled in red. In the right-hand corner, the date, and in the lower left-hand corner, the average July temperature. So we start out way back when in 1895, the average temperature across California in July was 72 degrees. Next slide. Then we move to 1920 and we see it tick up slightly to 73 degrees. Next slide. 70 years hence, it goes up to 76 degrees. So about a 4-degree increase in about 100 years. Moving forward to 2021, about 30 years later, it's ticked up 4 degrees in just 30 years. And then 3 years later, we're up to almost 82 degrees. So since 1895, the average July temperature has increased 12 degrees in California. Most of that increase has happened in the last 30 years. Next slide. So we know that we are breaking records now in real time across California and the West, but also across the globe. I mentioned that last month was the hottest average temperature month on record across the world. You may remember that in September of 2022, the West Coast broke nearly 1,000 temperature records as the longest, hottest heat wave in history. And then earlier this summer, many of those records were broken again just a few years later. So we are living in record-breaking extreme temperatures. Next slide. And if we're clear-eyed, the reality is that the carbon pollution, the greenhouse gas emission that we're emitting will continue to mean more temperature rise. So this slide shows really 2 scenarios. The top slide being if we can collectively across the world moderate carbon pollution and actually reduce carbon pollution. And the bottom set of numbers are if we continue business as usual with the pollution and climate change. And what we see, really that middle slide, is in about 15 years' time, even under a positive scenario, we're going to see almost a 5-degree increase. And it gets worse, obviously, if we don't move as a world to combat and effectively combat climate change. But regardless, we're going to see significant temperature increase across California. Next slide. What does this mean to somebody living in Sacramento, where I live, or the Bay Area, Los Angeles, Fresno? This is a great example. From up until 2005, someone living in Fresno could expect about 4 days during the summer where temperatures would exceed 106 degrees. And that will grow by the middle of the century to 26 days, and ultimately by the end of the century to 43 days. Almost a month and a half of these extreme temperatures. We also know that in the Central Valley, for example, but really across the state, these high heat events, these heat waves, are projected to be about 2 weeks longer than they normally are. And then even fairly cool regions like the Northern Sierra region, high heat events could occur 4 to 10 times more often by the middle of the century. Now, if you want to understand what it means in your own community, our state partners have a great tool called CHAT. And I'm going to ask Geeta to put it up. The acronym is CHAT. And it's essentially the climate heat assessment tool. And you can actually plug in your community to better understand what that looks like in your world. So hopefully that's a level set and gives us a sense of what we're experiencing and what, importantly, we should anticipate experiencing. Now, the good news is you'll meet people in this conversation who have been focused on preparing for these changes that we're already experiencing. And one of them is my colleague, Amanda Hansen. Amanda serves as our Deputy Cabinet Secretary for Climate Change within our Natural Resources Agency. And Amanda has spearheaded an interagency effort at the state to really get our arms around this threat, these risks, these impacts that we're already experiencing, and then really mobilizing state agencies to play their part protecting Californians from extreme heat. So Amanda, first of all, welcome to the conversation. Good to see you.
Thank you, Wade. Thanks so much for the introduction. It's so nice to be here. I'm just going to take a few minutes, as Wade suggested, to sort of zip through a quick history of California state's policy approach to extreme heat and also share a few points of progress. Just want to start also by saying that the work that we do to support and facilitate the efforts across agencies, really it doesn't take anything from our end to get people involved. People are really very focused on this and excited to be contributing. So, first slide, I'm ready. Okay, great. So, In 2013, a group of 3 agencies developed guidance and recommendations to protect public health from the increasing impacts of extreme heat. And this slide shows a screenshot of that document. Fast forward a few years, in 2020, we kicked off a public process to update California's strategy to adapt and build resilience to the impacts of climate change, all impacts. And very early in that process, it became clear that while we have plans to address sea level rise, wildfire, drought, and flooding, the state did not have a similar integrated approach to protecting California from extreme heat. Next slide. So we worked with agencies across the administration to develop California's Extreme Heat Action Plan. We're really very proud to point to the fact that the plan was developed through extensive public input, and that input deeply shaped both the plan's structure and the content. Next slide. Nearly a dozen agencies, along with many of their boards and departments and offices, worked together to develop the plan. And just want to underscore, this level of coordination reflects our administration's commitment to addressing climate change like the crisis that it is. So working across all agencies, breaking down silos, drawing connections between sectors. We play very different roles, all of our agencies, but we're all driving toward the same outcome. So a couple of examples of what does that mean? So CAL FIRE administers a program to green schoolyards. Well, they work super closely with California's Department of Education, as well as the state architect who has a lot of say over how school construction to protect students from the impacts of extreme heat. Another example is our California Environmental Protection Agency is working closely with the Department of Public Health, Department of Insurance, and the Office of Planning and Research to build out a new tool called Cal Heat Score, which is going to translate weather information into easy to understand health warnings. Next slide, please. This slide outlines a few points of progress in the 2 years since the action plan has been released. Agencies are working really hard to drive on implementation. We don't have time today to walk through all of the incredible work underway, but we've listed a few points of progress here. Next slide, James. A couple more on this slide, and just want to also sort of underscore all of these efforts are really supported by record funding that the state has invested through our climate budget, historic federal funding, thanks to the Biden-Harris administration, and just incredible leadership in communities and organizations across the state that are really driving action to address extreme heat. So with that, I'm excited to hand off to our moderator, Wade. Back to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Amanda. That was a tour de force of what we've been working on for the last couple of years. And in the chat is a link to our Extreme Heat Action Plan. I want to point out that the legislators have been really active on this front. And this heat score and heat classification system that Amanda talked about is really driven by our legislature and bills signed by the governor that the legislature has originated. So it's sort of an all hands on deck effort to ensure that we're protecting people from extreme heat. Now, I want to introduce Nick Schufro, and Nick is a colleague from Washington, D.C., and he is leading FEMA's engagement in extreme heat. And we all know what FEMA is, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I think a lot of us see FEMA in the news responding to certain disasters, but we wanted to bring Nick on because FEMA is doing some groundbreaking work helping communities build resilience to emergencies they're going to face. And for really the first time, this administration, the Biden-Harris administration, FEMA is actually engaged in helping communities build their resilience to extreme heat. So Nick, welcome, and share a little bit more about your role, but also how FEMA is actually starting to engage on this question around protecting communities from extreme heat.
Thank you, Wade, and thank you for having me this afternoon. So Nick Schufro, Risk Analysis Planning and Information Directorate, or RAPID, and my directorate is responsible for conducting assessments of risks ranging from natural risks to man-made and technological hazards. And we're now starting for the first time to include extreme heat. So that is significant. As Wade mentioned, most people are familiar with FEMA and think about FEMA responding to events, whether it's a hurricane, earthquake, whatever it is, natural hazards. But as we have also started over the last couple of years to look at building resilience, to reduce disaster suffering, and to build communities' resilience. So the work that we're doing around extreme heat, while there is some that we do after events, predominantly what we are doing is building resilience in advance. And FEMA's mission is the best mission of any federal agency. I don't know about California state agencies, but our mission is helping people before, during, and after disasters. So a lot of the work that people usually associate FEMA with is after disasters, but we're doing a lot, and the resilience component that I belong to does a lot of work beforehand. Couple of quick misconceptions about FEMA that I just want to straighten out. Most people think about FEMA swooping in helicopters, taking people off of flooded households in hurricanes or floods. Actually, we don't own helicopters. We mission assigned to other agencies. So we have the Stafford Act, which is our underlying authority, which allows us to work with all agencies and mission assign them to do work. So just wanted to clear that up. Secondly, we follow the mandate of federally supported, state managed, and locally implemented. And so we get invited in with many of our programs, many of our activities after an event. The work that we do around resilience, we're allowed to do, and we do in advance, so before disasters. So a lot of the work that we're doing pre-disaster mitigation is stuff that we're now doing in advance of a particular event. And it's not necessarily all Stafford Act related. Historically, just from turning now to extreme heat, historically, there have never been any successful requests for assistance under the Stafford Act for extreme heat events. For Stafford Act declarations, which many of you might be familiar with, there's a certain threshold, a dollar threshold, damage assessments. It's got to be beyond the state or territorial or tribal nation capabilities. And there have been 3 requests for help around extreme heat, but none of them have been successful. 2 in 1980 with Missouri, 1 in 1995 with Illinois. California did submit a request in October of 2022, trying to get assistance around a Stafford Act associated with a heat dome, but that was also denied because it was actually a series of wildfire events under extreme heat, under a heat dome, which precipitated the ask. So I like to divide the work that FEMA does into 3 separate areas. So the work that's traditionally thought of as after an event, and as I just mentioned, that there has not been an extreme heat Stafford Act declaration. There's also work that FEMA can do in conjunction with another event. So if there were a hurricane or an earthquake or some other event that knocked out power and there was extreme heat after that, FEMA could come in and provide emergency response measures to support the local state in terms of doing things from handing out water bottles to supporting with generators and other activities. But in terms of that is always something that happens after another event, is the precipitating event. And we like to, the heat exacerbates the impact of the final thing. Finally, as I mentioned before, resilience has a lot of work that we're doing to mitigate before an event. And so we have a couple of programs that I'll briefly mention. Sorry, I don't have slides on them, but we have a hazard mitigation program, grant program. And if there is an actual event, as I mentioned before, a state, tribal, nation, or territory, they are eligible for HMGP or Hazard Mitigation Grant Program funding. And that could address any natural hazard, including extreme heat. Second one is we have a new flagship program called Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, commonly known as BRIC. This came out of some legislation in 2018, the Disaster Response Reform Act, or DRRA. And what was notable about this was that for the first time, there's a 6% set aside for information, for funding, So if you have $100 of damages in 1 year, the following year, 6% of that is set aside for pre-disaster mitigation. And that pre-disaster mitigation can include extreme heat. And this is actually pretty exciting because for the first time, we're not subject to Congress going up and down in terms of our budgets. This is a straight amount depending on how much happens in every year. We also have a new program called Safeguarding Tomorrow through Ongoing Risk Mitigation, a revolving loan fund. It's a Storm Act is what we call it. And it allows us to set up a revolving fund for mitigation projects through including extreme heat. Those are some of our grant programs. Just to finish up, we have a couple of other activities that we're doing. So we do have a lot of outreach. FEMA has a Summer Ready campaign, which is designed to promote preparedness and resilience against extreme heat events. And it provides extreme heat events, safety tips for individuals. It's really intended to reach vulnerable populations and boost awareness of the impacts of extreme heat and provide simple, accessible, and culturally compatible actionable steps to prepare for extreme heat all summer long. And then the final thing that I'll mention is that we have a number of tools that are in place that California could use. So we have the National Risk Index, which is an online tool that provides information on 18 hazards, including extreme heat. Currently, it doesn't have future projections for extreme heat or for climate change, but we are working very actively, and we will be, we're working with NOAA and NIHIS and NASA and others to include looking at temperatures in the max in the 95th and 99th percentiles, and we'll be looking at future scenarios, higher and lower at mid and late century time periods to include that. We also have one other tool, the Resilience Analysis and Planning Tool, or RAPT tool. And this does include future projections of climate change. And what's great about this is similar to what Amanda said before, this includes information on vulnerable populations, where there's most risk, including for heat, and also infrastructure. So it takes the three aspects of it and pulls it together. So with that, I'll turn it back to Wade. I've taken enough time, but I'll be back later.
No, Nick, that's great. And as you were talking, I Googled BRIC, one of the programs that you mentioned, and I found that in just last month, in July, funding went out through that program that included funding for the first time, I think, or one of the first times, to communities to, pre-mitigate or to prepare for extreme heat. And one example in the press release is funding shaded bus shelters in Washington, D.C. to mitigate the impacts of extreme heat. Those of us who have been to Washington, D.C. in the middle of the summer can understand the importance of that. So it's great to know that even under some maybe restrictions of your authorizing statutes that envision, emergencies far different than extreme heat, you all are finding ways to help communities prepare for extreme heat. I wanted to ask you before we move on, though, I noticed that the Biden-Harris administration last week announced a national heat strategy, which was the first of its kind and really caught our eye in California. Can you just give any sort of top-line summary or sort of the implications of that first ever national heat strategy?
Absolutely. So, so what I think about extreme heat, there are three components that I like to think about: the science, the human health impact, and then the emergency or the response aspects. And what was really impressive about the national heat strategy is that under the NIHIS, which is the National Integrated Heat Health Information System, NIHIS, or the Interagency Working Group, there were about 27 different agencies that came together. And it was sort of like everybody threw stuff into the mix as to what they were doing around extreme heat. And then we went through a process of synthesizing and identifying different themes. And it really does represent the whole of the federal government, many agencies involved. And so NOAA from the science perspective, FEMA from the emergency response perspective, or building resilience perspective, it really came together. I was very impressed in reading the document. There are some guiding principles, and that we'll put the link in if it hasn't been put in already. But the guiding principles I really talk about being proactive, looking at a whole systems approach, considering the maladaptation that could occur, looking about equitable and just solutions. So recognizing that vulnerable populations disproportionately are impacted by extreme heat. It takes a very people-centered approach. It's looking at durable long-term solutions and multi-benefits. So it was really a very robust effort, and it was a lot of work by a number of agencies. Finally, there's one last graphic in here when you actually get it, which really shows that it's before heat seasons. There's work that can be done, work during heat season, after heat events, and there's a lot of planning that can go in. So there's a nice graphic in there.
Excellent, Nick. We're going to bring you back into the group conversation. I next want to introduce Tina Curry, and Tina serves as the Chief Deputy Director of what some people know as our state version of FEMA, which is the Governor's Office of Emergency Services. And Tina, I want to ask you, first of all, extreme heat, maybe 20 years ago, wasn't necessarily on the radar screen of Cal OES, but tell us now, how do you all, as the leaders of emergency preparation and management in our state, consider extreme heat as a threat or a risk?
Thanks, Wade. Absolutely, as we've already heard, extreme heat events are dangerous. They're becoming more frequent and long-lasting, and they're deadly. And what makes these particularly dangerous is that they're invisible. They're not like a fire or a flood where the public can see the danger and react to it. So for those reasons, this has definitely been something that is more and more in the forefront of what Cal OES is prepared for and does respond to support Californians. We have actually an extreme temperature response plan that's been developed and has been activated numerous times in recent years. And it outlines very specific state response action that correlate to the intensity and the severity of the heat event. We can predict to some degree when extreme heat events will occur. So we start to turn on even the public awareness about extreme heat every year at the same time. And then we can accelerate that response as we get warning from the Weather Service and others of an impending event of such severity that we need to increase the state response. This plan puts into motion something that's important here in California, which is a unity of effort amongst all the different state agencies. Similar to FEMA, we have statutory authority at Cal OES under the Emergency Services Act. So it's like the Stafford Act in a lot of ways at the federal level. And what that does is gives Cal OES the authority to task the different state agencies that have subject expertise or resources that can be brought to bear to support our communities to do that in a collective and coordinated way. And some examples of that, where state agencies are helpful in heat events is our Health and Human Services Agency, for example, has many departments that have an existing touch point with licensed facilities, for example. Those licensed facilities are housing some of our most at-risk Californians that we want to protect from extreme heat. Our California, Cal OSHA, under the Department of Industrial Relations, has protections in place for outdoor workers that we know are activated in times of extreme heat, and we want to fold into that coordinated response. So that's important. I want to punctuate. We have a defined plan just for this type of event because it is so critical and because it is becoming something that we more increasingly have to respond to. I'll add that public messaging is such an important component of an extreme heat event, both before, as we see it coming, and during an extreme heat event. It's important to impart the seriousness of extreme heat to the public and precautions and instructions that the public needs to take to protect themselves. As part of the extreme temperature response plan, there's a role that our Office of Public Information coordinates and leads to deploy an intensive multilingual messaging campaign that largely amplifies instructions from local officials, amplifies alerts from the National Weather Service, explains, what heat risk means and what it can do and how to protect yourself. And also the location of cooling centers. Those are, very frequent operation throughout the state and in many communities that have risk, and we want to point the public to where those are and how they can get help. It's also important to note, especially for public communications, that extreme heat is often paired with other hazards like wildfire. So our communications office, knows how to, kind of fold all of that into an organized public messaging and help the public navigate, all these multi-hazards that may include extreme heat. So, so those are just some examples, Wade, of how we folded this into emergency response. And so I'll stop there. And, if you have any other questions, happy to address.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tina. And I note behind you is our State Operations Center, which is really the hub of emergency response, whether it's wildfires, earthquake, et cetera. And I want to just ask you to share a little bit more about this, last intense heat wave that we had earlier in the season. I experienced Cal OES taking a leadership role as the weather projections were coming in. We knew it was going to be a heat wave. Just walk us through sort of what's working, particularly in the community outreach, letting people know about the heat wave and what they need to do to protect themselves.
Yeah, thanks for that question. We've learned a lot from the recent heat waves and the other emergencies that California has faced that has shown us, how important it is to do even more to help our most vulnerable, our most at risk, and our underserved communities within the state. So I want to highlight a couple areas. One is that in any emergency that rises to a state response, which there are many, the unity of effort that I mentioned earlier amongst state government is paramount. We have state agencies that every day are helping our most at-risk communities. For example, we have state agencies, whether it's through licensing or grants or other programs, they're supporting the unhoused. They are supporting individuals with disabilities. They are supporting, medically at-risk individuals or older Californians. They're supporting people in congregate settings. They are supporting outdoor workers. So Cal OES convenes those agencies that have those existing outreach and touch point and trust, frankly, with those communities and service providers under a umbrella task force, if you will, that is particularly looking at at-risk communities. And so those agencies, they meet and convene during wildfires, during earthquakes, during heat events, and kind of coordinate all their efforts so we're not doing it disparately, and identify and respond to and leverage each other's capabilities if there's assistance needs, so we can rapidly understand what's happening and then rapidly respond if there's help that's needed that can be provided by the state. So that's one example of something newer in our toolbox that focuses on these at risk. And again, it's something that's yielded a lot of success, if you will, because we've learned a lot and then redeployed that team over and over again in recent events.
That's excellent.
I have one more if there's time. I want to mention a program that we have called Listos California. That's a little bit more of a ongoing and not so much the kind of as needed during response that I mentioned previously. So this came about in recognition that there are already non-government and community-based organizations in our communities that are providing support and have the trust of at-risk Californians each and every day. And so these, what we call NGOs and CBOs, I'll use the acronym, are or could be an important resource for emergency preparedness and emergency response because they're already there and they're already doing these things. So what Listos does is providing the infusion of support directly to CBOs and NGOs. It's things like preparedness materials that are already translated into multiple languages and they're standardized so they don't have to come up with that content on their own. It's training for the CBOs and NGOs on emergency preparedness and response. And it's frankly bandwidth to amplify their efforts to support these Californians when disasters strike and in preparedness, and all to make them more resilient in the end. Listos does things like direct phone banking, making calls to Californians and encouraging them to sign up for emergency alerts if they haven't already done so in their communities. And finally, Listos, it's something that's intended to make lasting connections. So, for example, at the local level, if the local emergency services office didn't already have a relationship with these important organizations, then one of the things we want to walk away with is ensure that connection is made so they can go forth and strengthen their local response. So those are just some examples. All of this can be found at a website that that really packages, all the good LISTOS and other one-stop information on emergency preparedness, and it's called ready.ca.gov, and I think it is.
Yeah, Geeta did it.
Or will be soon.
Yeah, it's remarkable. There are some. She's doing a great job providing all these information resources in the chat. And again, we'll have a copy of this list with our recording tomorrow on our website. And of course, listos means ready in Spanish. And I love this idea of not relying on government to be the messenger, but for diverse communities across California, really building partnerships with those community-based organizations, those community institutions to actually share the information. Because as you point out, extreme heat is an invisible threat. And so unless people are getting the information about how hot it's going to be, how dangerous it's going to be, and what they should do, people, particularly at-risk people, could find themselves in trouble. I want to next move. I want to go south to Los Angeles, and I want to introduce you to the Chief Heat Officer of Los Angeles, Marta Segura. Marta, I'm so glad that you're here because really the rubber meets the road in protecting people at the local level. And I'm also so excited that Los Angeles has a Chief Heat Officer. So tell us a little bit about what you do and more importantly, what Los Angeles is doing to protect Angelenos from heat waves that we're already experiencing in such an intense way.
Great. A little bit of our origin story first. I was already the director of climate emergencies, and about a year later, the elected leaders realized that we could do more as a city to protect health and safety from extreme hazards, particularly extreme heat, because extreme heat is our most dangerous climate hazard. So the role crossed over from doing more of the climate mitigation, adaptation, emergency work to focusing on how we adapt and become more resilient towards extreme heat, while also reducing the disparities, because most of those injuries occur in low-income neighborhoods, pollution-burdened neighborhoods, where there are more pre-existing health conditions. Fortunately, I have a master's degree in public health, so I kind of fell right into that analysis and the data that the state provides around those injuries and risks from extreme heat was our guiding principle, our guiding light, to use that as a tool and a map to set some goals and to overlap that with Cal EnviroScreen, with the local demographic data and climate vulnerability assessments that LA County and the city of LA are conducting. And we're also mirroring the tracks that are in the state's extreme heat program. Nature-based solutions, greening is really important, but also crossing over as the Chief Heat Officer to work with the Emergency Management Department, the Mayor's Office of Public Safety, ensuring that we have the public awareness materials in multiple languages at the local level. Yes, we also use LISTOS, we also use Heat Ready, we also use SLARC. We take all the best materials from the county and the state, and now I heard that we have some at the federal government, so we'll probably use those as well. But really, we need all the phenomenal help that we can get, and sharing these ideas like we are today in this panel, and ensuring that we're applying best practices and aligning our plans to maximize those resources, because those resources are limited. As generous as the federal government has been, we are all under sort of a deficit model of funding. So we have to coordinate, we have to collaborate with the city, with the state, with the federal government. And in Los Angeles, we have the opportunity, because we'll be the first city, I think, to have the Heat Action Resilience Plan released in the future, we could be a model for other cities as well. And so we're here as a resource to other cities, other counties, and we want to make sure that they can focus not just on the disaster side of this or the emergency response side of this, but really combining all of the tracks that I hope that you'll see in the link for the Extreme Heat Program with some accountability. And that's what we've added to our framework, is ensuring we have some sort of metric system, accountability system, and dashboard to track the progress in accelerating heat mitigation and heat adaptation solutions for the city of LA, so that we can also see whether that reduces heat injuries, that reduces preventable deaths and mortality. And you mentioned earlier how important it is to work with community-based organizations. We have over 75 partnerships with community-based organizations in Los Angeles. But I think what's been missing in the past, and something the state and the city can work on more together, is ensuring that the municipalities, like Tina was saying, do understand which nonprofit organizations are working on heat resilience centers, and how do we include them in our local hazard mitigation planning, our local emergency operations planning? How do we respond to their needs during a heat alert, during other extreme weather alerts, et cetera, so that we're tracking the capacity that we have as a region, as a city, to ensure that the resources are there in the most vulnerable communities. And our Cool Spots LA map is the last thing I think I'll mention. It tracks all of the city's cooling centers, hydration stations, bus shelters, and all of the cooling amenities that we're investing in. But it also shows us the gaps. And the gaps are really important because I think that's where the state needs to invest more. That's where the city needs to invest more. And mapping these vulnerabilities out in addition to the gaps really can guide us to have a more equitable distribution of resources from federal government, state government, and also when we deploy those resources at a local level, we're more prepared. And this aligns very well with Biden-Harris's Justice 40. And that's another thing I think we're all trying to live up to, right? How do we track and monitor our investments in the historically disinvested communities to ensure that we're responding to that federal guidance of Justice 40?
Martha, I'm so glad that you're leading this effort in LA and you're on. And one of the things I love about these discussions is I always learn. I didn't know Cool Spots LA existed. This idea that, for Angelenos, they can literally go to a website and understand where they can get cool if they don't have air conditioning in their home. We're doing really interesting work with other governments in Mediterranean areas that are experiencing this extreme heat. And I was recently with folks from Barcelona, and they're actually doing something like this. And I thought this is a great idea to bring back. But of course, you're leading it in your own way in Los Angeles. I do want to I thank you for referencing these tracks or these priority areas in the state plan, and it sounds like you're doing something similar in the local plan.
Yep.
Just for folks who are tuning in, our state extreme heat action plan has what we call 4 action tracks. Build public awareness and notification. Obviously, let people know when these heat waves are coming, what they need to do. Strengthen community services and response. So in other words, ways that communities and cities as large as LA can support their residents through cooling centers, et cetera. The third action track is increasing resilience of our built environment. So this is everything from helping low-income folks get air conditioning into their homes to using cool surfaces that are reflective of the sun and therefore reduce heat. And then the last track is utilize nature-based solutions. We know urban greening works. We know removing concrete and replacing it with plants reduces that urban heat island effect that exacerbates heat. So I'm so glad, Marta, that it sounds like the work that you're leading in LA is really in parallel with the work from the state and just strengthening the connection. I guess the last question I'll ask you before we move on is how, the heat wave this summer, I know it hit the Central Valley a little worse than Los Angeles, but any takeaways from recent heat waves in terms of what's working and what are the biggest challenges?
Yeah, well, I have to say that the Emergency Management Department and General Manager Parks has embraced the role that I have as Chief Heat Officer and that my office has. So they've invited us into her emergency operations planning and adverse weather task force, which means we've included heat as a primary chapter in our local hazard mitigation planning, which also means she wants our advice on how to make the cooling centers and hydration stations and all of our deployment of resources more equitable. She is embracing that advice, and that is a phenomenal partnership that I have in the city of LA. And what that meant in real terms is we expanded the hours of our cooling centers in the most vulnerable communities, the most heat impacted communities. We looked ahead of time to see how we can increase hydration stations and other services for the in-house. It's the first time we really pre-planned not just services, but the deployment of infrastructure across Los Angeles, and we're piloting it so that we can continue to ask for more funding in the future to have more cooling centers and a real tight-knit, not just public facility cooling centers with LA County and the city of LA, but also nonprofit cooling centers and resilience hubs. So that's the plan for our future, having this really improved network of resilience hubs / cooling centers, but we're already making investments in bus shelters, hydration stations, and as we're preparing for the Olympics. And I think another key aspect of our success is being part of the mayor's climate cabinet and having heat resilience as a key working group of that mayor's climate cabinet, because having the support of your local mayor is critical to having a whole of government approach where every general manager and every department then gets behind the heat strategies that we're proposing for the entire city of LA.
Incredible model. Thanks so much, Martha. Appreciate it. I want to come to our last panelist I want to introduce, and that is Jonathan Parfray. Many of us know Jonathan for his advocacy for well over a decade as the leader of Climate Resolve to ensure that California is taking seriously this worsening impact. So much attention on wildfire, drought, flood, but historically not so much on extreme heat. So Jonathan, first of all, huge thanks for being that leader for so long that is holding us accountable for taking action. I want you to help us sort of keep it real in this discussion. We're a lot of government people talking about a lot of government programs. I think we're proud of our progress, but I want to ask you first, first just explain a little bit about why Climate Resolve has taken on extreme heat as such a priority. But then second, I'd really like your honest assessment of where things stand in California, where we've made progress and where we have a lot more work ahead of us.
Well, thanks, Wade. And it's really great to share this space with these wonderful people. I think we need to keep in mind what we're dealing with right now. The Los Angeles Times did a report in 2021 where they sort of went back through and examined the heat deaths in the state of California, and not the reported ones, but examining the knock-on effects that come in of cardiovascular disease and whatnot. The number that they came up with is kind of astounding. From 2010 to 2020, they found 3,900 additional deaths from extreme heat, and each one of those deaths was avoidable. And then in September 2022, researchers found that there were 395 deaths from this one September 2022 heat wave. Currently, the California the Department of Public Health is standing up a new program on syndromic surveillance to have in real time what the actual health impacts of heat waves are going to be. And I so appreciated Tina Curry's observation that heat waves are sort of a silent killer. And in that way, they're not splashy. It's not on the front pages. You're not seeing the destroyed infrastructure, but it takes place in the toll of human lives. And that's why Climate Resolve was interested in this as an issue, because more people die from extreme heat and are injured by it, and affects the economy more than any other natural disaster, but it's kind of blind and people just don't see it. And our approach, and we just really appreciate what the Resources Agency has been doing in developing their extreme heat strategy. And I think Wade and Amanda, you guys really deserve so much credit. And just take a snapshot of where we were 10 years ago. 10 years ago, the state of California, it didn't have a single municipal adaptation plan. There were no general plan analyses that looked at climate resilience. There were no LHMPs, local hazard mitigation plans, on climate change related harms. And then snapshot today, thanks to the bill SB 379 that passed in 2015, a bill, incidentally, that was championed by Nature Conservancy and Climate Resolve. There are now literally hundreds of plans today in California that countenance extreme heat events. That didn't exist 10 years ago. Now, the deadline for compliance of those plans is now passed, and the deadline was January 2022, and we still have hundreds more municipalities to go to be in compliance. Going back again 10 years, state of California did not have dedicated funds to directly mitigate extreme heat. And you've heard about some of the programs that are in play today. Strategic Growth Council's Transformative Climate Communities program, their Climate Resilience Center program, Resources Agency's Urban Greening program, really important on extreme heat, California Energy Commission's Cool Roof Regulations, Cal Fire's Urban Forestry program, OPR, I don't know if I can say Lucy. Am I allowed to say Lucy, Wade? The new name of the OPR agency. They have their new Extreme Heat Community Resilience Program, a really important program that will be awarding grants across the state in the coming months for their first round. The Public Health Syndromic Surveillance Program, OEHA, you've heard about their program that they're doing with OPR and other agencies and ranking, and then publicizing heat waves. Cal OSHA, you've heard, has an agricultural program since 2005, actually. It's really amazing. However, they have over 110 enforcement vacancies of officers that are budgeted, but they haven't been hired at Cal OSHA. And now Cal OSHA has jurisdiction to look at indoor heat temperatures. And we think that's a wonderful landmark decision. We were happily part of a coalition that helped bring that about. And in case you didn't know, the Department of Insurance recently issued a report on extreme heat's impact on the California economy. Kudos to the Department of Insurance. So I think compared to any other state, California is kicking ass and taking names on extreme heat. And yet, I mentioned all those deaths. I mentioned the economic impacts. We are so far from being done. I'm a nonprofit, so I can say the following. There's a proposition on the ballot in November, Proposition 4, on safe drinking water, wildfire prevention and natural lands. And this bond measure has some small, limited funding for extreme heat, very small compared to the other uses, but it is essential and important funding that is there. Last but not least, our organization, we believe in helping people. That is our motivation. So we like air conditioning, it's great, but isn't there something that we can do in the built environment to protect people? And we have been advocates of cool roofs as a way of using a passive technology, returning to the albedo, the reflectance that is part of the pre-industrial world, and to use that albedo as a way of shedding solar radiation that would otherwise turn into heat and sending it right back into space. The problem of climate change is that we have too much energy on Earth due to the greenhouse gases. This technology is a way of circumventing, getting past those greenhouse gases and providing cooling. We love the roofs, we love the cool walls, and there are experiments related to cool pavement as well. And so our organization has an initiative called Shine On. I hope we could maybe put up a link to the Shine On initiative. And we also have an event coming up at Climate Week. For those of you who are coming to New York, we'd love to be a host to you, where it has those two for one benefits of helping communities in the areas that are getting really impacted from extreme heat, and then shedding the solar radiation to improve the Earth's energy budget. So I'll just leave it at that there are ways of having multiple benefits through some of our actions.
Well, thanks, Jonathan. Again, Climate Resolve and so many other non-governmental organizations driving us to do more and coming up with these creative ideas that we can actually scale, like cool roofs. I want to bring everybody on the screen here, and it's been a fascinating conversation. We have just a little bit of time before the top of the hour and we end. I want to do a speed round, and I want to ask each of you, what is a priority or something that you want to see major progress on here in the next few years? What do you what are you taking away as a sort of a key priority, whether in your community or in your agency or in your work? What's something that you're really prioritizing driving forward? I'll start where I left off. Jonathan.
Yeah, we'll work backwards maybe. I would love to see literally hundreds of California municipalities updating their local hazard mitigation plans, and then submitting those plans to Cal OES and FEMA for funding to mitigate extreme heat. That would be my dream.
Love it. Specific? I think it's probably music to Christina's ears.
Yeah.
How about you, Marta?
Sure. I think I'll follow that lead. Alignment between heat action plans at the local level and the local hazard mitigation plans. And I'm grateful that FEMA now requires climate hazards for the first time as part of these local hazard mitigation plans. I did notice, though, Nick, that our consultants that normally help with LHMPs aren't very comfortable yet with extreme heat or equity issues. So we need to change the industry as well, so that the industry does follow the values of the state, of the county, of the city, of the federal government. And there's climate, equity, and health goals, metrics, and it's a multifaceted approach. We're not just looking at temperature, we're looking at health outcomes and safety outcomes.
Thank you, Marta. Tina.
I could not have said it better than Jonathan and Marta on the local hazard mitigation plan. That's where it's at. That's where we seed kind of the resilience, which is the goal, is to be better at coping with these events rather than responding, increasing our response. And I would add that on the BRIC program, BRIC, that Nick mentioned, California has been in the leading edge, as we should. We're the biggest state to secure those funds for California. So I would love to add on to the other two speakers. And, as we see this hazard, rightly so, reflected in the local mitigation plan, as it is now in the state's mitigation plan, as one of our top 3 hazards in the state, to then yield the investment in what we're going to do about it through these mitigation measures that have been mentioned already.
Thanks so much, Tina. Nick.
So hazard mitigation plans fall into my directorate also. And so very familiar with them and some of the challenges that Marta mentioned as we start to see climate change and extreme heat. I would love to see communities do what makes sense in terms of having a strategy to address extreme heat, not particular about whether it goes into hazard mitigation plans or a standalone heat plan. Different communities have different things that they like. And so as long as they have a strategy and alignment, there's a lot of resources that are out there, and taking advantage of that makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. And thanks for all your leadership across the country on this topic. Amanda, the last word.
I would say I'm super focused on the update that California is doing to understand how climate change is likely to impact California in the future. We are under our 5th climate change assessment is underway, and we're downscaling all of the global models that help us understand what's coming, and just getting that information out to local and regional partners so that we can all make more informed decision making is a really big area of focus for our team, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and others who are working on the 5th assessment.
Thanks so much for flagging that. Let's go to the last slide. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us. It's been an incredible conversation. I hope you agree. We had over 250 people stay with us the entire hour. And so thank you for participating. Thank you for what you're doing across the state or even out of the state on this topic. If you have any suggestions for us related to what we've talked about today or topics for future discussions, please hit us up on this email, secretarysuggestions@resources.ca.gov. And please do stay safe as we continue to experience extreme heat this summer and moving